So grateful that you're here. So grateful that you joined us tonight. We're really, really happy about the session that we have planned with Shequille. We know that there's going to be lots of great information, hopefully, and I know you'll have lots of great questions to ask as part of the learning that we're offering tonight. So if you don't know me, my name is Michelle Davis, founder and CEO of MVD Consulting Inc. I've been hosting these DEI and webinars this year as a way to have important conversations on different aspects or different issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We started with recruiting diverse folks, recruiting diverse talent. In February, we then had DEI and employment and law and human rights. We had Shanira Chowdhury, we had Leroy Briggs for the recruiting diverse talent. We had DEI and data, big data, impactful storytelling. That was a really great session that we had in April. And I'm so thankful to have Shequille Gayle here with us this evening for our session tonight on workplace investigations, preventing and responding to complaints. Oftentimes in this work, you hear very harmful things happening or occurring in workplaces. So Shaquille is going to shed some light on things employers and employees can do to prevent complaints of harassment or discrimination, as well as how best to respond to these complaints when they do occur. So thanks again, Shaquille, for being here. So thankful that you accepted the invitation to go on this journey with us. So we're looking forward to your presentation.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'll start with our land acknowledgement. So of course, you want to acknowledge the lands, the unceded land from the First Nations, the First Peoples, Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So I acknowledge the land on which I live, work, and play is located on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga. At the time of European settlement, it was the Mississauga who inhabited the north shore of Lake Ontario, including what would become Ajax, which is where I reside today. These lands are the traditional and treaty territories of the nations covered under the Gunshot and Williams treaties. And an African ancestral acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge those of my ancestors who came to Turtle Island as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in past generations. Then to my ancestors who came here involuntarily, brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. So I pay tribute to my ancestors of African origin and descent. So just quickly about us and the work that we do. So we help not-for-profit organizations, public agencies, and businesses really deepen their diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment so that they really can ensure that they are creating workplaces and organizations that are equitable, just, safe, happy, and healthy. So our vision is really to help our clients change the world for the better by serving others in ways that are meaningful. Our work is, of course, guided by our set values, our core values that serve as our compass, shaping our decisions and our initiatives. These values propel us forward, ensuring that we remain true to the vision that we have for our firm. So some of the services that we provide, we have a fractional chief diversity, equity, inclusion officer, where I can come in and work with an organization on a part-time contractual basis to really help them deepen their work, or if they're having areas where they're struggling or they don't have the staff capacity or skill set to be able to do the work that is required, I can come in and alongside and work with a team or department or the whole organization. We also conduct workplace DEI audits, looking at some of the issues, looking at where an organization is and how they can get to where it is that they want to go. We also carried out a lot of research and evaluation. So we will consult on projects, designing studies, as well as collecting, analyzing, and presenting data. We also do a lot of professional training and development. Of course, tonight, our contact information, but we'll get to the next slide where I get to introduce to us our special guest, speaker tonight, Shequille Gayle, who is the founder and CEO of SJG Workplace Consulting and Investigations, Inc. Shequille has been actively conducting investigations pertaining to harassment, sexual harassment, workplace violence, discrimination, and human rights over the past 5 years. Shequille has extensive experience in conducting legally defensible and trauma-informed harassment, violence, and human rights investigations for various public, private, and not-for-profit orgs, and has conducted over 100 investigations. Like, that's incredible. Under both provincial and federal legislation on harassment and violence prevention in the workplace. So in addition to his practical experience conducting investigations, Shequille has an educational background centered around leadership, adult education, workplace learning, and social change. Mr. Gayle has obtained an advanced certification in workplace investigations from Osgoode Hall Law School, which provided training on conducting a trauma-informed approach to investigations. So really looking forward to Shequille diving deep into what that means, what that approach looks like, and how we can use that in our workplaces. Shequille also holds a master's degree in adult education and community development with a specialization in workplace learning and social change. Within this program, he obtained extensive knowledge and concepts relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, where he engaged with topics on truth and reconciliation, as well as gender and race within the workplace. So we have a super, super qualified person who will be speaking to us this evening and leading us through his presentation. So Shequille, I hand the virtual mic over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Michelle. So I'm just gonna get my presentation ready and then we will get started. Sure if that works. Maybe let me know, Michelle, just confirm if you can see my screen.
Can't see your presentation yet. No, it's coming up now, yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, I can see, yeah.
All right. So I want to first thank Michelle and MVD Consulting for having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone today about these important topics, one being diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as workplace investigation. So I want to just give you a special thank you for allowing me to be here. And I also want to thank everyone who has attended the webinar on your Wednesday evening to meet with us and to speak with me and to hear what I have to say, but also and as I'm hoping that we will engage in a discussion that is meaningful after the presentation, just that there's things that everyone will be able to kind of take either home with them or to the workplace to make it better, safer place to work, a more meaningful place to work. I will say that throughout the presentation, if there are any questions, I'm going to ask that folks actually just write it in the chat. I won't necessarily be able to see what's happening in the chat, but I know that when folks are going through a presentation, there are questions that maybe will come to your mind. But once you get to the end, you kind of forgot or lost your train of thought. So just write whatever you're thinking or feeling into the chat so we can discuss those at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, we'll get started. I think my PowerPoint is actually frozen. Just give it a second.
Do you want to stop sharing and try sharing it again, Shequille? Technology is great, but only when it works, right?
Sorry about that, folks. Okay, perfect. All right, so the topics that we're going to be looking at today is first really emphasizing why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important when addressing workplace complaints. A lot of people struggle to kind of reconcile these two factors together for the reason that they think that taking that type of approach might be biased towards one group or put another group at a disadvantage, and that's not the case at all. So we're really going to be looking at why it's really important to think about how we include diversity and equity inclusion principles into workplace complaints, the conflict resolution process, and workplace investigations. We're then going to look at the role of what workplace investigations do within an organization, whether an external investigator is brought in to do an investigation for the workplace or if it's done internally. We're then going to look at defining harassment and discrimination. There are definitely a lot of misconceptions, and sometimes these words are thrown around a lot in workplaces, but we're really going to look at what these words actually mean legally and how these definitions are applied when an investigation is being conducted. We will then move to the roles and responsibilities of both employers and employees and looking at how employers more specifically can take a diversity, equity, inclusion approach to how they address complaints that come to them. And then last, we're going to look at the importance of a trauma-informed approach within an investigations process. So looking at what it does, as well as looking at what it actually looks like in practice. So we're first going to begin with a poll with some interaction with you all here. And I kind of just really want to gauge people's perceptions of how prevalent they believe harassment is in their workplace or not. So the question is, what percentage of employees do you believe have experienced harassment in their workplace? And the option that you see on the poll is 5%, 25%, 55%, and to 75, it should be 70%. So if the 75, let's name it as 70. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And Michelle, if you can just let me know what the results are, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see it, or maybe it will come up when it's done, but just in case.
Okay, sure, I'll do that.
That'd be great, thanks.
I'll leave it up for another minute if you haven't had a chance to vote on that. So Tanya in the chat says 75, it should be 70. Okay, Tanya. So we have one vote for that. Anyone else? Before we shut down the poll? Okay, so we have 2 for 75, which should be 70, and we have 1 for 55. Okay, let me see. People are doing it in the chat. All right. So let me see. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 for 70, 75, and 1 for 55. So the majority for 70, 75, Shequille.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Michelle. So what's the answer? Let's see. So the magic number is 70%. There was a study conducted by the Canadian Labour Congress, as well as the University of Toronto and the University of Western, back in 2020 and 2021, and they found that over 70% of employees had experienced at least one form of harassment and abuse in their workplace. They also found that those most likely to experience a toxic work environment were women, Indigenous people, members of the LGBTQ2S plus community, and people of color. So historically equity-seeking groups. And they also found that 1 in 4 Canadians who reported said that reporting actually made the situation worse. So what does this mean? From a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, this really means that DEI is critical in how organizations go about developing their investigative practices, processes, and approaches, as us equity-seeking groups are the most likely, based on the data that we have, to engage in the investigations process. We also see that many people who are reporting are saying that going through or putting a complaint is actually making the situation worse, which really shows that there aren't the policies or practices in place, or the manner in which employees are deciding to resolve these issues are not bringing satisfaction to the people who are bringing the complaints forward. So we really want to look at, and we will look at this more at the back half of this presentation, and looking at it, practical, simple approaches that we can all use to ensure that, you know, when a complaint comes forward, it's done in a manner which really serves the people who are coming forth with the complaints and are engaging with the conflict resolution process and workplace investigations. I think a really good thing to note here as well is that historically, decisions that are rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion ultimately benefit everyone who participates in anything that, you know, or that thing that's been rooted from. The degree of benefit can obviously vary and be greater for some than others, but everyone ultimately will benefit from practices that are rooted within diversity, equity, and inclusion. So why investigate? Why do an investigation as an employer or as an employee? Like, what's the benefit? So we want to go through kind of 3 main points, which is to why an investigation is important. The first piece is the element of impartiality. So investigations provide a fair and unbiased examination of the complaint that has been brought forward, as well as the individuals involved. So everyone who participates in an investigation should feel, once the investigation is done, that they were given a fair chance, to kind of explain what had happened to them, or explain their side of the story, and that whatever result came from that investigation was done based on fairness, someone who didn't know either parties and was really just looking at the facts and applying it to the policy that, you know, was allegedly breached, or the legislation that was allegedly breached. The next piece is, you know, the establishment or reestablishment of trust. So when an investigation is done, or the choice to investigate is done, it really communicates to the staff from the employer side that they are taking allegations of misconduct in their workplace seriously. And that ultimately will encourage individuals to not only speak up about complaints, to speak up and submit complaints about wrongdoing in the workplace, but it also will encourage staff to work with their employer in creating and maintaining a safe work environment when it comes to other matters in which the employer might be asking for that help or that collaboration. And then the last piece is the opportunity for change. So for the most part, investigations will usually result in recommendations, not only just for what can be done to address the behaviors, but what the workplace can do to ensure that complaints that have brought forward don't come up again. And without investigations, sometimes there's just some elements or things that would not come to light without it. So it really gives the opportunity for an assessment to be done on an organization to see where they can be better, to address certain areas to ensure that the workplace is a safer place to work for all. Okay, so we're gonna get into the definitions. We're gonna start with workplace harassment, and this is a caveat. I'm not sure where everyone is situated today, whether in Ontario or another province, or maybe you're federally regulated. But we're going to be looking at the Ontario definition of workplace harassment. I will say though, for the most part, the definitions are fairly similar throughout the country, and whether you're provincially regulated or federally regulated, there are some nuances, but we will be looking at the definition within the Ontario Health and Safety Act. So that definition is, quote, a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought to be known to be unwelcome. Now, the term vexatious, that term imports a subjective element into the definition of harassment. So that basically means that anyone who's putting forth a complaint or saying that they've been harassed, one of the elements is that they must feel that whatever comment or conduct that has occurred is objectionable or has been seen as annoying, distressing, or agitating to the person who's raising the complaint. So we're also going to unpack a lot because it's just a sentence, but there's a lot to unpack in that one sentence of harassment. So the first thing we want to look at is the subjective and the objective element. So we kind of already looked at the subjective piece. So the first element is that the person that has experienced the behavior has to find it objectionable or agitating or unwelcome. The other piece is an objective piece. And I'm going to go back to the definition. When we're looking at that objective piece, we're looking at the phrase, that is known or ought to be known to be unwelcome. So that is the objective piece there. To state, okay, would a reasonable person subject to the same behavior that the complainant, we'll say, had experienced, receive the act as unwelcoming? Now, that is usually done through something called a reasonable person's test. And it's really what a reasonable person is someone, and we're going to use Canada because we're Canadian, but really, the average Canadian who values the same values and principles that we value as Canadians in terms of how to appropriately conduct ourselves in a workplace, would they see this behavior also as unwelcoming? So that is the objective piece to the definition, and as opposed to the subjective piece. So the person, one, has to feel that they know that the behavior that they have experienced is unwelcome, but the investigator also has to show that any reasonable person who would have experienced that behavior would have felt the same way. Now, something I want to point out that, and again, speaking to a more of a DEI perspective, is that even though we have these elements, an investigator really should be looking at the point of view of the person who's raised the complaint. And I'll just give a very general example, but for example, there could be a complainant that is working in Canada, but maybe they're a new comer, and certain practices or behaviors that are occurring here may be perceived as something different based on their cultural upbringing. So an example I'll give is, for example, a male manager might be doing one-on-one performance evaluations and may be scheduling to do these one-on-one meeting with a female individual, but based on the location that they picked, it was maybe perceived as harassment or sexual harassment. Essentially, maybe the implications were that, based on where the meeting place was, that there were going to be some inappropriate interactions. And even though when the investigation is done, it might seem that a reasonable person, so someone who wouldn't necessarily define that as something that is unwelcoming, it does help the investigator portray to the employer kind of the mindset of the individual and what they thought at that time, and can lead to recommendations that can prevent that. So for example, maybe having those meetings in another venue that would be deemed acceptable to everyone, for example. So that's just an example in which, even though, again, that reasonable person test might lead to an unfounded complaint, there's still an area in which employers can benefit and make sure that practices and procedures are being changed so that everyone feels safe engaging with the workplace. So that's the subjective and objective piece. We also have motivation. So one of the big misconceptions when it comes to these complaints usually comes from the respondent side, but can also sometimes be communicated from employers as well, is that, you know, the person didn't mean to do it, or I didn't think that my actions was going to cause this, or I didn't mean for my actions to make, you know, Susan upset, for example. Now, when we're looking at the definition, the intent of the respondent's action is not a factor in whether harassment is deemed to have occurred or not. Investigators look at the impact of the behavior on the complainant and or the witnesses. So we're not looking at, you know, maybe you didn't mean to offend your coworker by saying a certain word, but it did. What was the impact on that person? And that's what we're looking at. Another piece that I want to really touch on is the poisoned work environment. So when we're looking at the definition of harassment, generally, a behavior or conduct is directed towards a specific person, and that is usually the person that is putting in the complaint. However, there can be instances in which the behavior is not necessarily directed at a specific person. However, if that behavior interferes with an employee's work performance or creates an intimidating or hostile or offensive work environment for everyone involved, that can lead to a finding of a poisoned work environment, which is a sub-element of harassment. And then the other big piece that we want to talk about is a course. So when we look at the definition of harassment, we're looking at a course of vexatious comment. So a course is really to state that harassment usually is established through a series of incidences that happen. It's not just a one-time event. It's something that has happened over and over and over again through a various point of time. However, there are instances in which, when harassment is being investigated, a single act of sufficient severity may also constitute harassment. And that's why usually investigators really want to understand what the impact is on the individuals involved, because that can ultimately determine whether a one-time incident was considered an act of harassment or not. Okay. So in addition to knowing what workplace harassment is, excuse me, it is also equally important to know what workplace harassment is not. And again, this will speak to, or knowing this will really help people understand what are the other informal ways of addressing complaints without going through a formal investigation and potentially putting people at risk of being re-traumatized through that process. So generally, workplace harassment does not include any reasonable action taken by an employer or supervisor relating to the management and direction of workers in the workplace. So again, setting reasonable objectives or deadlines, legitimate performance management, establishing performance improvement plans, even being critical of bad performance is not workplace harassment. However, there are situations in which, you know, these types of things are being done for reasons that are not reasonable. So for example, maybe someone is being critical of bad performance, but it actually has to do with that person's gender. Then that would be considered workplace harassment. So just to kind of differentiate and understand where those nuances are. However, generally, when it comes to the supervision and management of workers, that does not constitute workplace harassment. Another big piece is looking at difference of opinions or minor disagreements between coworkers. Usually has workplace conflict. Again, difference of opinion, personality clashes. Yes, that can cause conflict in the workplace. However, that does not necessarily mean that there is harassment in the workplace. Sometimes, if those conflicts are left unchecked, it can then lead to harassment or lead to discrimination, which we'll get to shortly. But generally, those things at a very low level does not constitute workplace harassment. All right, so the next piece or definition I want to get into is discrimination. So the definition of discrimination is the denial of withholding or equal treatment and opportunity to individuals or groups with respect to employment. So just because we're looking at the workplace, we're just looking at the employment factors. However, there are other exclusionary or protected areas, I should say, such as housing, that are also covered by these grounds. And this definition is covered by the Ontario Human Rights Code. Now, discrimination takes a three-part test to prove that it has occurred. So the first part is that you have to identify with a member of a protected group or have an identifiable characteristic that is related to one of the protected grounds underneath either the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Canadian Human Rights Act, or any of the other human rights legislation within each of the provinces. The second part is that you would have experienced something called adverse treatment. And we're talking about adverse treatment with respect to employment. We're talking about areas in which you have experienced adverse treatment in things like job applications, recruitment, training, transfers, promotions, apprenticeship terms, dismissal and layoffs. It also covers things like rate of pay, hours of work, holiday, benefits, shift work, discipline, and performance evaluation. So you would have to have experienced a negative impact in one of those areas. And then the third test, or the third part, is that the ground of discrimination was a factor in the adverse treatment. And I highlight factor because a lot of misconceptions as well when we're doing investigations is that folks believe that the ground of discrimination has to be the only and entire reason for the adverse treatment for it to be considered discrimination, and that is not the case. There could be a situation in which an individual was not given a promotion, and there could be a bunch of other reasonable, rational reasons for why that person not get that promotion. However, if one of them has to do with anything with their identifiable characteristics that is protected by the code, that would then meet the test for it to be a ground of discrimination. So just really wanted to kind of hammer that home and clarify that it only needs to be a factor in any decisions that negatively impact those who are part of a protected group. And here are just not all, but some, and one of the most common protected prohibited grounds. Again, these are the protected prohibited grounds under the Ontario Human Rights Code. These grounds also vary, again, based on provinces, and also the federally regulated legislation also varies this as well. But we're looking at, for Ontario, age, ancestry, citizenship, ethnic origin, place of origin, race, color, sexual orientation, marital status, even including if you're single, creed, disability, family status, sex, gender identity, gender expression, and record of offenses. All right, so we're gonna get now into the employer responsibilities, and here we're gonna do another poll, just to kind of get everyone back engaged. So the question I have for all of you are, do you believe that employers are obligated to investigate all allegations of workplace harassment that comes to their attention? Yes or no?
So folks are dropping their answers in the chat, Shaquille. So Christopher Lawrence says capital YES. We've got another yes. We've got two yeses so far. One with a capital. And Tanya and Chelsea also say yes, yes, yes. So we have four yeses.
Okay. Let's give about 10 more seconds and then I will reveal the answer.
Oh, Jackson's going out on a limb and saying no. No question mark. So we have one no. Four yeses, one no.
Okay, well, thank you for everyone for participating in that. I will say just based on the answers, I wish the answer I was gonna say was wrong because that would be a lot more business for me. But the answer is actually no. The employer is not obligated to investigate all complaints that come to their that are raised to them. A big misconception from employers is that they are obligated to conduct formal investigations into any complaint that is raised when that is not necessarily the case. Looking at this sentence here, it says an employer owes a duty to see that the work atmosphere is conducive to the well-being of its employees. That doesn't not necessarily mean that you need to investigate. It just means that the employer needs to take appropriate action to ensure that the work atmosphere is conducive to the well-being of their employees. And sometimes it doesn't mean that it's an investigation. However, sometimes it can be done at a more informal level. Now, the reason why this is a positive, and people might be saying, well, that's not good, but the reason why this is a positive is because this not only gives employers the opportunities to resolve certain complaints in an informal manner, but it also gives the opportunity for employers to incorporate their employees in the resolution process. And a big issue that we see with sometimes with investigations that the employer thinks they're doing a good thing by jumping in right away and doing an investigation, but sometimes that's not necessarily what the employees actually want, right? And what employers don't understand sometimes is going through that investigations process is a very long and strenuous and taxing and emotionally draining and mentally draining process. So if there's opportunities for employers to resolve these complaints that come their way without putting their employees through that, that actually gives the employer more credibility and gains more trust that they can resolve things without putting their employees through that. So hopefully that maybe will lose me some business tonight, but it is something that I really want to stress to a lot of folks that either are here or that will listen to this recording after the fact. Okay, so if an investigation is not necessarily what employers have to do, what can they do? And how can they take an approach that fosters diversity, equity, and inclusion into these actions? So the first piece is really understanding what the workplace is. A lot of employers feel like the workplace is just the physical place of work, so their office, and they don't have to deal with anything outside of that, which is incorrect. The workplace, how I like to say generally, is essentially where any workplace relationships or activities exist, are any events that are sanctioned by the employer. So that can be work-related travel, that's social functions, that's conferences. It can also even be kind of social media groups, WhatsApp groups that are created to facilitate work projects, for example, as well. So anywhere where these work relationships exist, that is the workplace. So once employers understand that, they understand what the responsibility is, again, in making sure that the work atmosphere is conducive to its employees. Now, the big piece I want to really talk about is how to really address and what actions to take when a complaint actually comes to you as an employer. This is really a make it or break it. You have one chance for first impression, and you have really one chance to really under or show what employees bringing a concern to you, um, how you're going to manage it moving forward, and if they're going to have trust in you as an employer, and how you decide to help resolve their complaint. So I like to really promote this type of strategy. I call it the 3E approach. It's to empathize, educate, and empower. So when someone brings a complaint to you, the first thing you really want to do is just acknowledge how the person is feeling. What you do not want to do is question anything that you're being told at the time, or again, make comments like, so and so wouldn't do that, or so and so didn't mean that. They're a great person. That's not what you want to do in that situation. That person's upset. That person has experienced something that's negatively impacted them, and they're trusting you really to not only do something, but they're trusting you with their feelings and their state of mind. So at that point, really just listen to them. Don't question what's being told, and really just give that person the opportunity in that moment to feel that they are being heard by their employer. The next piece you want to do after you have empathized with them and heard what they've had to say is educate them. And what I really suggest employers to do if they don't already have it already is to build or develop something called a behavior continuum. And essentially what that is, it's essentially any behaviors that you deem as inappropriate or a breach of any misconduct from your organization. And actually, in addition to naming what those are, putting in what behaviors are examples of those particular definitions. So it can be harassment, it can be discrimination, it can be violence, it can be sexual harassment. What does that actually look like in various forms, whether it's physical, verbal, psychological? So really developing that tool. If you don't have that tool, again, you can work with the person who's come to you to look at maybe general definitions or information online, just having that discussion to really understand if what the person has experienced actually had breached any of those company policies, and to also give them some choice or direct them on how they could go about resolving the issue informally, if necessary. So again, based on what you're hearing, you might think that it's appropriate for them to maybe go like, ask, have you gone and spoken to the person about how you feel? You think it's appropriate? They say no. Maybe that's something that you suggest. In addition to suggesting that, you can say, if you don't feel comfortable doing that on your own, either I or someone who maybe a neutral third party for the two of you who you feel would be comfortable there to discuss that. In addition to myself, be there to be and kind of figure out what happened together. So offering choices that employees can do to resolve these situations on their own. So again, kind of moving in between educating and also empowering that individual. You also want to educate and inform the person on the resources that the organization has to help them cope throughout the process, or just cope in addition to what they've experienced at that time. You as the employer might not have the tools to do that, but you may have resources such as, for example, EAP, in which you can provide or suggest those folks utilize while they're going through what they just occurred, which in their eyes may be a traumatic experience. So that's the 3E approach that I always like to give. The other big E is the empower. So when you're giving the person the opportunity to communicate how they feel, no matter it could be resolved, you also want to, throughout the process, the conflict resolution process, keep them in the loop. You want to maybe say, I have this idea of how we can resolve this. What do you think about this? Would you be open to doing these types of things to resolve the situation? So keeping them a part of the conflict resolution process and giving them a say. I think one of the pitfalls that employers have is they get the complaint and say, okay, thank you, we'll take it from here. And that person is now complained has lost all autonomy in what happens next, which can cause further re-traumatization. To mitigate that, I would highly suggest that you try your best to incorporate your employees in your conflict resolution process and really give them a voice in that. Now, moving on to the next piece, really auditing the workplace or doing a kind of a self-reflection of what the workplace is. And I think the first step is to really buy into the idea that environments influence behavior. So these behaviors are coming up for a reason, and they're being allowed to happen due to whatever's happening in the workplace. And when I say the behavior, I'm not necessarily even talking about the behaviors of the alleged respondent, right? At the end of the day, the complainant brought this complaint in for a reason. Sometimes they bring a complaint in believing that it's because so-and-so did something to me, but it's something bigger than that, right? So having the opportunity to really look and see where the workplace can improve, and that involves looking at the physical space itself. And it can be something as simple as, one office is a bit too hot, or it's a bit too cold, or there's not enough room for everyone. It's a bit too congested. People don't have kind of room to have space for themselves or to do the work they need to do, which is causing agitation. It can be something as simple as that. It can also be something a bit more broader, more complex, like the policies and practices that have been put forward, or maybe the lack of reinforcement of those policies as well. So really looking at where there can be improvement to foster a safer work environment. And also includes training, providing training, making sure people are taking the training and taking the training seriously as well. I think one of the big things that I see is, especially with a lot of harassment training, they're all done virtually, and no one really takes the time, even though they're mandatory, to really go through them and understand, again, what the definitions are, what the conflict resolution processes are. So maybe having a mix of virtual and in-person training in which we can really engage with that material is something that you can do if you do identify that as an area of improvement. And then again, going back to the empowered piece, is really collaborating with the parties involved to find out where they think the areas of improvement are, and if you guys agree, think of an action plan of what can be done to address that. And sometimes that's the resolution. Sometimes folks don't necessarily want an investigation, but they want the employer to really look at maybe revamping the policy and providing training to people. And it can be as simple as that. So again, engaging with your employees can really help, again, mitigate the need for an investigator and also resolve the issue at hand. So everyone's happy at that point. But if an investigation is needed, based on the severity of the complaint, and that's usually things like such as sexual harassment, very serious allegations of discrimination and human rights breaches, or very long-standing and either systematic or systemic harassment that someone's experienced during a course of many years. Those are the things that you definitely want to look into, regardless of if it can be resolved informally or not. And if an investigation is needed, what the employer really wants to do is obtain an investigator who really understands the lived experiences of the people involved in the complaint. And again, you want to do that because a main part of people who engage in the process, they want to feel like they're heard and they want to feel like they're understood. And if you can find an investigator who understands the lived experiences of the people who engage in these investigations, as we know, the majority of them are usually equity-seeking groups, they can understand where that person's coming from. And again, their complaint might not lead to a founded complaint just because they understand where they're coming from. However, they can give you as an employer a really proper assessment of that person's perception and why they perceive that, and maybe relate it back to recommendations that can better help you make the workplace safer for everyone. So that's one of the main things that you want to do. Really invest and really take the time to select an investigator who understands the people that are going to be involved in the process. Another big piece that you want to do is make sure that you're always providing participants involved in the complaint with the resources that they need. So things such as EAP, any counseling, anything of that nature that they can utilize while going through the process to deal with any additional trauma that they're facing participating in an investigation. And then the last piece that you want to do if an investigation is needed, usually during, is to ensure that people who are engaged in this process are not having a bad experience due to things that could be resolved or underneath the employer's control. So that, again, giving the opportunity for people to have flexible work schedules so they can attend interviews at certain times, giving people time off during work to write their responses as a respondent maybe to a complaint. Doing those little things as an employer really helps employees who are in this process be engaged in the process and does not add additional stress to like mitigate the amount of stress that they're experiencing dealing with the investigations process. All right, so I'm gonna move to the employee responsibilities. Now, some of these responsibilities, again, are not outlined in any legislation or anything like that, but there are things based on my experience that I believe employees can do to help make their workplace a better place to work and a more inclusive and equitable place to work, and especially dealing with areas of harassment. So the first piece is prevention. So to prevent things such as harassment or discrimination taking place in your workplace, highly encourage employees to take part in the harassment training provided by their employer and to really and to engage with it with good intention and good faith. Clicking through all the slides to get it done in 3 minutes, you're not gonna get much value out of that training if it's done virtually. So really take the time to go through the slides, go through the material, engage with what's been presented so you are informed of what to do if you do face a behavior of harassment. I would also advise folks to attempt to speak to the people that they believe is contributing to a toxic work environment. So if you're dealing with that, if you're experiencing that behavior directly and you feel it's important you feel like it's appropriate, to speak with that person, take the opportunity to do so. If you are witnessing someone treat somebody poorly, take the opportunity to speak with that person and kind of say, I don't think you should have done that, or really understand maybe why they've done that and try to see if you can resolve that situation within the employee group if appropriate. And again, adding on to that, big believer of calling in as well as calling out behaviors I believe do not align with your organization's values and practices. And a call out can be as simply as saying, that behavior that you just did does not align with what we value as an organization, and it's not acceptable here. That's a simple call up that you can do to a colleague that you feel is behaving in a way that is unacceptable and doesn't align with the organization's values. You can also do a call in. I'm not sure if many people know what a call in is, but a call in is essentially if you observe behaviors that are inappropriate, but you feel like it's a result of maybe ignorance on that employee's part, is to really bring them in separately and have a conversation with them about how their behavior is actually impacting others, and maybe try to help them realize that that is an issue. And sometimes that helps too, and some people just need that education. So it's an art of figuring out when to call in, when to call out, but when it's done effectively, it does a lot of good in terms of making sure that the environment is safe in the workplace. Now, if prevention does not work, you want to report. So those responsibilities include submitting a complaint to your employer promptly if the informal means of addressing the behavior have not worked. You also want to talk to your employer if you have not necessarily experienced the behavior yourself. If you witnessed it, definitely go to your employer and let them know of the misconduct that you're witnessing at work as a witness. And again, if you are someone who is actively engaged or has actively been involved in the behaviors, talk to your employer about resolutions that you are seeking and be prepared to work with them to reach one. So What I mean by that is, the resolution that you may want may be something that the employer cannot necessarily ensure, but they want to work with you to see if together you can, there's some common ground that can be found in terms of resolution. I do advise employees to work in good faith with their employers to see if there can be a resolution that's reached that is doable for the employer and is satisfying to the employee. And the last piece, again, if the complaint does go to an investigation, is to participate. So engage in good faith with the investigations process, and that just really just means, really being truthful, open, and honest about what's happening in the workplace and what's gone on in that particular situation. The investigators really relying on the people they speak to really give them an account of what happened because they were not there, and they cannot appropriately assess not only the actions but also the other underlying factors that may be present if an honest conversation is not had. So I always recommend employees to really engage in good faith and really trust the process when they're in it. And I also um, recommend employees as well to show up. Show up if the workplace investigator is asking for information, to provide it if you have it. So really just, again, engaging in good faith. And the last piece I say is to accept opportunities to assist the employer when it comes to, recommendation time, and they kind of want to make some changes and they want to include you. Accept those opportunities and work with your employer. That's going to help establish trust, I think, between the employee and the employer, and also create a healthy work environment for everyone. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the slide now. And the last couple of slides, I want to talk about the importance of a trauma-informed approach to an investigation. Now, I first want to talk about why having a trauma-informed approach is so important, especially as an investigator going in and doing these investigations. And this applies to anyone who has done an investigation or has a responsibility of maybe doing one in the future. These are really the key points that you want to look at. So the first point is providing empowerment. So when you have a trauma-informed approach, you're able to give choices to individuals involved in the process, and in a process that they have very limited control. So you really want to ensure that in this process, when it goes to investigation, it's really in the hands of the employer and the investigator at that point. You want to make sure that you're giving the participants as much choice as they can, so they feel like they have some power or autonomy in this process, and they're not just moving with the forces of the investigation itself. A trauma-informed approach also addresses stress. So it really provides the opportunity for the investigator and participants to manage stressful interactions. The things that they're talking about, especially for complaints and respondents, they be traumatic events that had occurred. And you really want to, when you take a trauma in first, you're really taking that into consideration and helping those individuals manage that throughout the investigations process, especially the interview process. The other important piece is establishing trust. So with a trauma-informed approach, you're really able to establish the trust between you as an investigator and the individuals that you're speaking to. And once you establish that trust, that really gets people to open up and really speak freely about what's going on, not only in that particular situation, but in their workplace. And that's going to help any investigator create not only accurate findings, but also to provide meaningful recommendations to the employer about an assessment of what's going on in the workplace and what the employer can do to make things better. And then a trauma-informed approach also maintains the dignity of those involved. So provides a space for people who are engaging in this process to not be judged and not to be re-traumatized while going through the investigations process, again, especially during that interview. All right, so I wanted to talk quickly just about the actions that are taken that would exemplify a trauma-informed approach in different and various stages of an investigation. So one is notifying the parties that you're going to be taking this doing this investigation, or sometimes even notifying a respondent that they are responding. I mean, they may not know. So when first meeting the parties, you always want to have a face-to-face, whether that's in person or virtual, but you want them to see you, you want to see them, and you want to be able to then explain the process to them so they understand what they can expect for investigation. And they also have the opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. As an investigator, especially for myself, as I've stated before, I've done almost 100 investigations, and of those 100 investigations, I've never had one where I've seen the same person. So usually these individuals who are in these processes or in this investigation for the first time, they don't know how it works and they're scared. So you really want to explain that process, really advise what they can expect, and if they have any questions, answer them and ask them transparently and honestly. And the last piece is you want to advise folks of their rights, responsibilities, and let them know what the next steps are immediately after that conversation. So they, again, looking at that empathize, educate, and empower, but really letting them know what they're responsible for. Rights can include being able, having the right to see the complaint and respond to it. Responsibilities can be keeping the investigation confidential, and then letting them know what will happen next. So that's providing that information that they need. Moving over to conducting the investigation, specifically the interview. But when you're looking at an interview, providing choice of locations to meet. If they want to meet virtually, and that's an option, do that. If they want to meet in person, try your best to accommodate that. You want to let the person know during the interview what they're going to expect before you get into any questions. You want to be able to show empathy, not sympathy, as an investigator, because sympathy can actually make you be viewed as not as biased, but you can definitely show empathy, and you want to show that you're comfortable discussing sensitive topics if you are discussing things such as sexual harassment and things like that, because people can sense when you're not comfortable, and when you're not comfortable, they're not going to want to share. So and they might feel judged. So you really want to make sure that you're showing confidence, and you're showing that you're comfortable discussing these topics in a way that is respectful and dignifies the individual that you're talking to. Another big piece is also providing breaks. Very simple thing to do, but especially if investigations are running long, there's a lot of things that you're going through, you can see that the individual that you're speaking with is starting to get anxious speaking about certain things. Don't hesitate to offer a break and give them a chance to recoup themselves, calm down, and come back and continue speaking. Don't try to force a long interview. If things are moving too long, it doesn't hurt to kind of stop and tell that person, we can meet at another time to finish it. Again, sometimes holding long interviews can really add a lot of additional stress to somebody, especially if the topics or allegations are very traumatic. And the last piece you want to do is allow a person or an animal as a support for that individual that you're speaking to, so they feel more comfortable going into that investigation and speaking. So moving on to post-interview. So providing investigative documents. Sometimes that's pre, but usually it's post. So summary notes, the reports, things like that. Making sure they're using neutral and objective language. You're giving participants a chance to make any additions or changes, so that it is an accurate account of what they've said, so they can make sure that it is. Excuse me. And if you need any clarity, to provide the opportunity for them to clarify things, so you're making decisions that are based on clear information that is available to you as an investigator. And then throughout the investigation, what you want to do as an investigator in a trauma-informed approach is really just acknowledge to the people involved that you understand that the process is not an easy process, and talking about resources that they can get from their their employer, or if there's any other resources that are available to them that can help them throughout the process. You really want to reinforce your role as a neutral party, and then reinforce that in the behaviors that you do, such as using neutral and objective language and not being judgmental during your interviews. You want to enforce your role as someone who is not on anyone's side. You're really just going to collect information and provide an appropriate assessment to the employer to help better the workplace and resolve the issue. And then again, the last piece is just being aware of not only the current but the past historical experiences of those participating in the process, whether equity seeking or not. Again, to have an understanding of the perceptions of the behaviors that they may have encountered, and seeing again how the employer can better itself, whether again it's through physical spaces, policies, practices, training, any of that sort, to ensure that they're evolving and being more progressive and making workplace safer. So that is all for me. I want to thank everyone again for coming today and listening to what I had to say. I'm hoping that you learned a lot, and we'll definitely gonna have some questions and discussion once I'm done. But if there is any, if you would like an opportunity to speak with me after this seminar, you can book a consultation with me by going to my website. You can email me directly, or you can add me on LinkedIn. I would love to engage with all of you more to talk more about these topics and workplace investigations as a whole. So I do hope that you take the opportunity to do so. Michelle, thank you so much. I'm just going to keep the slide up just in case folks have questions and I want to revert back to a slide, or they want to revert back to a slide where they have a question. But again, Michelle, thank you so much for allowing me to be here tonight to do this.
Shequille, thank you so much for being here. This was incredible, incredible information. I learned a lot. I took lots of notes too. Great information, understanding. You really went in depth in terms of explaining to us what the investigation process is and some of the ways that it should be approached, whether using a DEI as well as a trauma-informed approach. So I know I found this really, really helpful, and I hope that everyone else did too. See, Christopher is applauding you. Tanya says thanks in the chat. So there was one question I want to throw out to you.
Sure.
So how do employers decide what is investigated and what is not investigated?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I'm gonna hop back
Okay.
to here. So as a general rule of thumb, an employer should be able to justify that any actions that they've taken was conducive to the well-being of its employees in its work atmosphere. So again, say for example, if it's something like a sexual harassment complaint, usually informal processes are appropriate for those types of complaints, and really trying to resolve that informally or not addressing that at all does not see that the work atmosphere is conducive to the well-being of its employees. And a formal investigation is usually a choice of action that would address that. Again, looking at also allegations that are very serious, so it's not necessarily even sexual harassment, even serious allegations of maybe discrimination, things like that, or things that are not easy to kind of determine and talk through and need to be kind of analyzed by someone with an objective view. That's kind of when you want to send in an investigator, whether externally or internally, to investigate those types of complaints. You also want to investigate where complaints in which the employer either has an implication, or if the employer, or the implication is the employer cannot be unbiased in that situation. That's when you also want to investigate as well. So those are, I would say, the main things that employers want to think about when they're deciding if they want to resolve something informally or not, is the severity, the implications that they might have on that complaint, and the last thing before, kind of if there's been a pattern, like a long, especially if it's a long-standing pattern of behavior, at that point you want to investigate. And sometimes like listening to the staff, like they might say, I want an investigation. And sometimes the employer might say, well, this doesn't necessarily need an investigation. But I would say for employers to really listen to their employees and um, listen to what they want as well. So that's something that they can also do, is to incorporate again their employees in that decision to when they're making it, to see what is the best approach and what is the approach that's going to um, provide the employee with a sense that they've been listened to, they've been heard, and that their issue has been addressed.
Absolutely, Shaquille. I can see that sometimes maybe the complaint doesn't warrant a formal investigation. However, in order to do that reparation process, to repair relationships, to rebuild trust, as you're suggesting, like it may warrant that a formal investigation is conducted.
Sure.
So Tanya put a question in the chat here. If the employer is a perpetrator, then what happens?
That is a great question. So I'll just talk based on my experience. So usually if the employer, and I'm gonna try to maybe give two examples because it could be necessarily the organization, or it could be a person like a director, an executive, or a manager. So if it's an individual, you can ask the person up top, or complain to the person up top, and it'll be their responsibility to investigate that complaint. If it's someone who's very high up, or you're trying to raise a complaint on your employer or your manager, and they're not doing anything really about it, what I usually would suggest to folks to do is go to the Ministry of Ontario, the Ministry of Labor, and you really have to put in a complaint to say that your work is not addressing your complaint, really, that you have for them. And really, what the Ministry of Labor will do, they'll come into the organization, they'll do their own investigation. If they see that there isn't anything being done to address your complaint, they will order the employer to do an investigation on so and so, whether they're manager, director, whatever the case is. And then usually it'll be up to the employer to hire someone externally to do that. Now, if it's the organization itself, so you might be maybe not contesting a person, but a particular policy or a practice that the employer is engaged in, you can still go through the Ministry of Labor. You can also, depending on what the issue is, like if it's a discrimination issue or something like that, systemic racism, you can go through the International Human Rights Commission and put a complaint through them as well. And that is really when those mechanisms are put in place to really look at the organization and keep the organization as a whole, not necessarily a person, but keep the organization accountable and liable for any wrongdoings that they may or may have not done. And that process in itself is a whole nother process in which you can engage in mediation or go through a full tribunal. So those are different avenues that you can take if the employer is the perpetrator, depending on if it's the organization is the perpetrator, or like an individual high up or is designated as an employer is the perpetrator, or you call them respondents, but the respondent.
Great. Thanks so much for that response, Shaquille. So Chelsea has put in the chat, how do you prevent additional occurrences during the investigatory process in situations of harassment or discrimination?
I'm not sure the question. I'm not sure if Chelsea, you mean like additional occurrences between the two parties involved in the investigation, or if you're just talking generally how workplaces can mitigate complaints of harassment as a whole. So I'm not sure if you want to clarify that in the chat, and then I can answer.
Between the two parties involved, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You can't necessarily prevent it. I think there are things that are in place to help mitigate it. So usually employers will have within their harassment policies verbiage or language about reprisal and retaliation to show that there shouldn't be any negative behaviors or continuing behaviors between the parties because they've submitted a complaint or because they're involved in the complaint as a respondent. Usually, if that does occur during the investigation, that is actually tacked on to the investigation as an additional complaint that would then be looked at. So there's that. Depending on the severity of the allegation, and it is kind of a last resort, but if there is a possibility in which the behaviors are going to continue, the employer can separate the parties while the investigation is ongoing. So some employers will put individuals on no paid leave of absence, or they'll put an individual in another work area pending the investigation. So there are things that can occur to ensure that the parties don't really interact and to mitigate any future occurrence of harassment. And there's also just the confidentiality piece. So just making sure that people who are involved in the investigation are keeping the conversation strictly with the investigator and maybe their support person to make sure that this situation doesn't spread to other folks and that cliques are getting involved and things like that escalate. So those are I think one of the three main things that can be done to mitigate additional behaviors of harassment occurring during the actual investigations process. However, sometimes those things don't work. I would say 90% of the time they do, but sometimes they don't. And it's usually a reprisal or retaliation issue in which, again, is tacked on as an additional allegation. And if those are founded, it's also sent to the employer, and it's really looked at as sometimes an aggravating factor or finding when it comes to an employee as well. Is that think people were either trying to tamper with the investigation or they were treating somebody poorly because they were complained on. So all those things are looked at.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Sure.
In the beginning of your presentation, you shared that 70% of persons in a study reported experiencing harassment and discrimination at work. And you also said that a lot of times people find that when they did report, it actually made the situation worse. So do you find so is it in those situations where it has worsened? What are employees doing who are experiencing the harassment and bullying? Are they resigning? Are they going on sick leave? Do you have an idea of, in workplaces where they're not handling complaints well, what happens to the employee who's experiencing this very stressful situation of bullying and harassment or discrimination and harassment?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know what? A lot of those behaviors do happen in which people will either go on sick leave. A lot of people will actually, put in their complaint while they're leaving. A lot of people do that as well. So a lot of people are actually, sometimes like sitting or suffering in silence, not letting anybody know. And it's only until they have a way out in which they'll talk. And I think that also speaks to people's perception of these complaints and say that, they're going to put in a complaint, it's going to get worse for them, or they're going to put in a complaint and, nothing's going to happen. So why do it type of thing. So I would say, Michelle, it really depends. Like the behaviors that people exhibit to show that they're not happy. A lot of it happens even before the investigation starts, in my experience.
Mhm.
In terms of when the investigation process is happening, I guess in my experience, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but I think a lot of people, a lot of people that I get from people that I talk to, I'm doing my investigations, I thought this process was going to be so scary, or I thought I was going to need, these supports. And because of how you've handled it, and again, this is why I talk about the importance of the trauma-informed approach, because of how you handled it, I feel like I'm not happy, and it's still stressful for me, but you've made the process easier. So that's been my experience in terms of during the investigation, but I will say definitely there's been lots of situations where up to the investigation, you can kind of see a lot of people are fed up. and they kind of maybe just put in a complaint and leave, or they put in a complaint and go on sick leave and they don't really want to talk. So it's really hard as an investigator trying to get those people back in and to reestablish that trust on behalf of an organization. It is doable, but I think that a lot of folks, especially when they've been dealing with these types of behaviors for a long time, they really just lose trust in the organization and they really disengage um, in the investigations process, so they don't engage in good faith
Mhm.
when they're in the process. So that's kind of what I've experienced. I'm not sure if I answered the question completely, but
You did.
that
No, that was
okay,
great.
that's
So,
kind of my has been my experience with people
mhm.
who are reporting. I will say that, I guess, going back to that third piece, when you talk about people who put in a complaint and say, well, this is actually worse. Again, I think it leads to, the employer thinking they're doing the right thing, and they're trying, and they get the complaint like, okay, we're gonna fix this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, and they don't incorporate or understand what the person who put the complaint actually wants and what their needs are. And at that point, the person who put in the complaint just feels totally powerless. Now they're stuck in this investigation they didn't want to be in, because the employer said, okay, you complain, we're going to do this. And then what happens is the investigation is done, and they don't even get the result they wanted. So they went and did, 4 to 6 months of dealing with this investigation to come to the conclusion nothing happens. There's nothing there. It's like, why did I do this? And I think that's kind of where they're like, okay, this was actually worse for me doing this. I actually feel even worse now that I've gone through this, and what was it for? So I think that's really the I think the hammer home when it comes to that third point in my early slides about people going in, and that's actually worse.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a comment in the chat that I was going to say the number is probably even higher because a lot of people suffer in silence, right? Because they're not saying anything, they're not reporting. Because again, as you said, they've lost faith um, with their employer. But I see the time. I wonder if I could ask the final question. I hope no one will. Anyone mind if I ask the final question? Oh no, someone put Tanya put one in the chat, so Tanya gets the final question. For certain situations, if the person doesn't want to literally confront their colleagues, can they send them an email to discuss what the matter is? Does it always have to be like an in-person, like you say, to discuss with someone, or can it be an email communication? What would you suggest?
It technically can be email communication. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that. I think sometimes with emails it can translate um wrong, or people don't really understand the tone of sometimes the email, and there can be further miscommunication that can actually um exasperate or make
Mhm.
situations a bit worse. I maybe send an email saying that maybe this happened, and if they're willing, they'd want to maybe meet in person to discuss that together, maybe one on one more. I think maybe the email would be more to kind of set something up to talk to somebody in person. If
Mhm.
someone's not comfortable speaking with someone, um, face to face by themselves, again, I think that's when you really want to lean on your employer to kind of say, this is my situation. I don't want to necessarily go to investigation. I want to have a conversation, but I don't necessarily feel comfortable having this conversation by myself. And usually that's in situations, especially if the respondent is, that person's manager or supervisor, something like that, where there's a power imbalance and they don't feel comfortable kind of going to speak to them because they feel like that's gonna make things worse, or they might be treated differently because they went forward and discussed it. So going to that person's superior, if you have if you're unionized and you have a union rep that you want to go to and trust, and feel like you want to have that conversation with them, not to discuss any labor disputes or anything like that, but just as someone as a support to kind of listen and be witness to that what that conversation was. I would say to lean on those resources that you have within the workplace to facilitate that discussion. But I wouldn't necessarily advise doing an email to 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 um, to kind of address that situation.
Okay, awesome. Well, I got permission from some folks that I could have the last question. So I was just thinking, wondering, Shaquille, and I think you did mention it, but if you could tease it out a little bit more for us. So do you find in the approach that you use to workplace investigations, this diversity, equity, inclusion, and trauma-informed approach, even if employees are not happy with the outcome, are they more satisfied because of the approach with the investigation?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I tell everyone that I actually am engaged in investigations and when I first meet them and I'm going through that process and explaining my role. And I really tell them the investigator's main role um really is for at the end of the day, when this is all said and done and the decision is done, that the person that's been engaged in the process says, you know what, I may not agree with what the findings were. And sometimes the investigator's totally wrong. Like sometimes they get it wrong. But they can say that, I don't agree with the findings, but I can say that I was treated fairly. And that's the really big piece of, and that I was heard. And that's really the big pieces that you wanna nail down. You want to, as an investigator, you really want to make sure that the procedural fairness is there, and you want to ensure that the trauma informed approach is there. And I think when you do that, I think as you said, Michelle, a lot of people are not happy with the result either way, in my experience with investigations, because again, as a fair person, you're seeing that the respondent may have done something wrong. You might even say the complainant may have done something wrong, or there wasn't anything necessarily there that the issue actually wasn't this behavior, something way bigger than this, right? But when you're coming in as someone who's objective and you're not emotionally invested, right? Sometimes when you're emotionally invested, you really can't see that, especially right away. But the main goal really is for, at the end of the day, for someone to say, you know what, I don't agree with that. I'm angry about the results, but I can respect that. Someone came in, did their job, and they gave me a fair shake in terms of telling what I had to, expressing what I had to say, providing the evidence and my side of the story. Um, and everything else that involved in the investigation. So I would say definitely, I get that. I get that often. I don't usually get people who are happy with the result, and honestly, I think that's a positive. It shows that I was actually fair, and addressing the complaint. But again, as long as they're saying, you know what, I was treated fairly, that's all I care about, and that's all really an investigator can really give at the end of the day is that fairness and the opportunity to be heard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shaquille. Very helpful. Yes, I really do think there's such tremendous value in the approaches that you discussed today and that you use to the work. Because in work, when you hear investigation, it's scary, it's frightening. People have experienced harm and trauma. So it is often, when people are at their worst, or have to then go into this long process. But being empathetic, listening, being transparent, being there, like such important pieces that I'm sure that the persons who work with you really do value the way that you handle the investigation. So thank you so much for your time this evening. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. It was such a pleasure having you here. We have recorded the session, so we will send out by the end of the week a copy of the recording. Shaquille has been kind enough to give permission for us to also share a copy of the presentation slide, so you'll have that. So look for that in your email and look out for future sessions that we'll host, please, and let us know what topics would you like us to cover in future webinars. Because these are such important issues that we often don't understand or are not able to tap into the expertise of persons who are leading in their field. So please let me know what other topics you would like us to cover in future webinars. So thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the rest of your week. Great. Thanks so much, Shaquille. That was great. I think everyone enjoyed the discussion and the information. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. Thank you.